maybe I'll tell you why. Sister Margaret is a member of the Sisters of St. Francis of the Newman Communities. She's currently stationed in upper state New York at St. Bonaventure University, I believe, in that area. Sister Margaret was a member of a commission that rewrote the Third Order Regular Rule. When I was a novice, we studied her work, and afterwards I studied her work, and I'm still studying her work so many years later. She's also a graduate of the Antonianum, the University of St. Anthony of Padua in Rome, and I believe you're the first woman to receive a doctorate from the Antonianum. She didn't stop there. She also started teaching at the Antonianum afterwards. Then she became the Mother General of the community of the Whitehall Franciscans, or the Sisters of St. Francis of the Providence of God, for a period of time. Then she was the director of the Franciscan Institute, the Institute of Study of St. Francis at St. Bonaventure University. And she was the first full-time woman president of St. Bonaventure University, where she served for a 12-year period when she was surrounded by the Order of Friar Minors. So she's already done her penance, and she can move on after that. Since then, she was one of the founding members of the Franciscan intellectual tradition. One of the things that the Franciscan intellectual tradition has able to do is to digitize all the writings about Francis and by Francis, and all the writings of St. Clare, and put them online for anybody to read for free. So it's franciscantradition.org if you're interested. One just all together, franciscantradition.org, and you tap on documents and you have all of the writings about Francis, by Francis, and St. Clare as well. She's the author of a number of books, the TOR Rule, a source book, the first woman Franciscan, St. Clare of Assisi, Her Form of Life. Her latest book is Light of Assisi, The Story of St. Clare, available on Amazon.com. I don't know if you'll get a discount for listening to her tonight. She's also the author of many articles and has given talks on Franciscan spirituality in practically every continent in the world. And that is not an exaggeration. My parents used to call me a frequent friar because I was flying all over the place. You can be a frequent sister, traveling all over the place. I had joked about, and I do joke with her from time to time, that I am the world's expert on her. Because when I was doing my doctorate in higher education, I did a case study of Franciscan leadership in higher education. Sister Margaret Carney, the first full-time woman president of St. Bonaventure University. So I have the dissertation to prove that I know her. But even apart from that, we've been friends for many years, even before I did that dissertation, and I think she's one of the best Franciscan scholars in the world. So Margaret, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Michael. How are we doing sound-wise, Abraham? We're okay. I am very, very pleased to be in Colleyville this evening. I realized in my conversations with the friars that I've been connecting with the friars who've been here over the years without ever actually being in your church or on your parish properties. And I have to say, it's pretty awe-inspiring. This church is just magnificent. And I know that you have a vibrant faith community here, and I'm excited to see the plans for the new mosaics that are about to go up. So I wish you all blessings, and it's a delight to be here as we start to move forward toward the Feast of St. Clare. Now, in that really very generous introduction that my friend, Father Michael, gave, you might figure out she can't be all that young. So the one little detail that's lost out is I am between the 2 cataract surgeries, okay? This eye, done. This eye, not. That means half the time I'm doing this, half the time I'm doing this. So if I get confused at any point, blame the cataract surgery, all right? I'm never sure whether I'm going to get blurry or clear when I start out. So what I would like to do this evening is briefly walk you through a biography of who Clare of Assisi was, and then pull out from that story 3 or 4 episodes or themes of her life that argue for me, and I think increasingly for many other people, why she remains a really relevant and powerful saint in our church. And of course, when people hear her name, they immediately say, oh, the companion of St. Clare, that's all you need to know. If Francis liked her, she must have been okay, right? But there is so much more to her story, and not so much more that is more important, but so much more that tells us how she came to become a companion to Francis, and then we might call her a co-conspirator with Francis to restore evangelical living in the Christian communities where they were living and teaching and preaching and giving witness to people. And then when he died, she outlived him by almost 3 decades. She became the guardian of the purity of what they understood to be the gospel imperative. So, 30 years after the death of a founder, people start to say, well, he wanted to do it that way, but times have changed, and Clare would go, we're still going to do it that way. So she had an enormous importance in the beginnings of our Franciscan story, but it's only within the last 5 or 6 decades that, especially for us who speak English, a lot of that research and material has become available. And so if you're saying to yourself, well, I really didn't know anything about her, let me tell you, tons of Franciscans didn't know very much about her either. And so I'm happy to help everybody catch up. So we're going to get started. Clare was born in the city of Assisi, which is halfway up a mountain in the region of Italy called Umbria, at the very end of the 12th century. And she was born into a really significant family of that city. This family was, we would say, upper crust. In fact, they lived in a palace. That was the word used. It really meant a large multi-family dwelling right next to the cathedral. So it's where the nobles lived, where the episcopal leaders lived. And when her family was described, her family would be described as being composed of 7 knights. That would be like saying there were 7 Fortune 500 CEOs in her family. In other words, the family wasn't just a mother and a father and their children. It was a consortium. Today we would use the word a corporation even, of families that banded together to join their land, their reputation, their wealth, and their military ambition. Because if their city was besieged or a part of their country, or depending on whether they were allied with the Pope or allied with an emperor, you needed to raise armies constantly, and the families needed to do that. So she came from that level of society. But before she was 10 years old, she was already experiencing the downside of power struggles between that level of society and a newly emerging reality for the cities of medieval Italy, which was that more and more wealth was being created, or the economy was being stimulated, not just by agriculture and land ownership, but by people who did trade in the cities. So, for example, we know the father of Francis of Assisi was a cloth merchant. So all of the arts and trades that made it possible to live in a kind of a city atmosphere, the men and the women who plied those trades, whether they were brewers of beer, bakers of bread, weavers of cloth, they were increasing the wealth of the cities, but they had no political voice. They were the left outs. And they began to resent that deeply, and it reached points of armed conflict, to the point where Claire and her family fled the city of Assisi and took refuge in a neighboring city, Perugia, for several years. It seems kind of laughable today. It would be like saying, well, it wasn't safe for you to be in Fort Worth, so you took refuge in Dallas, like side by each. But they were literally like two different worlds that could be at war with one another. During that time, another person from Assisi was deeply embroiled in these battles, and that was Francis of Assisi, who in a battle against the town of Perugia was captured and held in a prison there for at least a year, as far as we understand. So Claire most likely knew about this. The people of Assisi surely knew that there were partisans from Assisi in their prison. And we have to ask, how does a young girl begin to understand what is the price you pay for these violent episodes and for the damage that they do to a family and the disruption that they bring to a family? But in any event, by the time she was a very young teenager, the family was able to return to Assisi. But Francis had been restored to Assisi before that. And when he returned from his time as a prisoner of war, he was a changed young man. At least more than one Franciscan writer has described his situation as an episode of what today we would name as PTSD. But what the writers describing him describe as just a man kind of taken out of his normal, joyful personality and spiritual sense of ease and comfort, a man in search of a new meaning for his life. But as he emerges out of that period and he receives the blessing of the bishop to preach and to lead others in an understanding of the gospel, the whole city of Assisi is taking note. And of course, at first, the notes aren't friendly. He's seen as a madman. He's seen as throwing away a really good economic future in his father's business, just kind of a crazy guy who's throwing everything over. But little by little, what he is sharing about what he's reading in the gospel of Jesus Christ is beginning to hit home with people of the different classes in Assisi who've gone through all of these experiences. Yes, they've got a prosperous little town, but violence and upheaval and disruption seem to be threatening them all the time. Claire begins to pay attention to this. He was blessed and accepted by the Bishop of Assisi, and if you were to visit Assisi, you would see that the home of Claire and the cathedral are right next door to each other, which means if he was preaching there, she most likely would have had a very good opportunity to hear him preach. And probably the real moment of breakthrough was one of the men of her family abandoned his place at the family table to go and join these poor friars. Probably caused a lot of upset in the family at that time, whose name was Offreduccio. That was her father's name, Offreduccio of Favarone. In any event, Claire really begins to see that this Francis message is unique, and it is drawing her and encouraging her and inspiring her. Little by little, each of them discovers that the other would like an encounter, and they arrange to meet secretly because she doesn't want her family to be upset. She saw what happened when her cousin went over to join the friars. She doesn't want to
cause a big upset. And so they begin to meet, and Claire is clearly looking for guidance. Like, she sees that Francis is saying we've got to live the gospel differently, without a lot of over-interpretation. We've got to have the courage to walk in the footprints of Jesus, to appreciate what it means that he became one of us, what is the real meaning of the incarnation, that he was born as a little baby, died naked on a cross. She's asking for help to understand that. And over time, she discerns, with his encouragement, that she really wants to be part of this movement. She wants to be part of this new way of trying to live a Christian life, not going off into a monastery or hiding away, but amongst the people and available to help the people sort out the problems of living an authentic Christian life. And so, by the year 1212, over Palm Sunday weekend, the plan for her to do that is completed. And she appears at the Palm Sunday Mass that morning in the cathedral, dressed in her finest clothing, which was the spring ritual of the young women. When they came to Palm Sunday Mass, and I think this used to be true in a lot of Catholic families, certainly for Easter you dressed up, but some families dressed up already on Palm Sunday. So the women dressed in all their spring finery, and the young men got a good look, in church. It was the beginning of the springtime, and maybe romance was in the air, but also it was sort of a way to celebrate a holy day. Claire goes to the Mass dressed in her finest and receives directly from the bishop the palm. He comes to her in the church, hands her the palm instead of waiting for her to come to him. And it was probably a sign, all is well, you can carry out your plan tonight, because the bishop was in on this plan. That night, under cover of darkness, she left her home, left the city through the gate, which would have been impossible. It was after curfew, but the gate was on the bishop's property. And she was escorted down the valley, which is no easy walk. I've done it more than once or twice. And there in the tiny chapel of the Porciuncula, Francis and the friars were waiting to receive her. And she traded that beautiful dress for the coarse, ordinary, undyed sackcloth of a poor working woman, a penitent in the language of the church. Right after that beautiful, beautiful moment of her joining the brothers, she was taken to a nearby Benedictine monastery, not because that was her desire, but they were very clear that they understood once the family knew what she had done, there would be, excuse the expression, hell to pay. And that Benedictine monastery had a special papal protection that if anyone tried to do any violence to that monastery or any nun in it, excommunication was immediate. And so she went and stayed in that monastery for a number of weeks. Sure enough, her uncle, with a number of armed men, came to demand her return. They failed because she demonstrated that she had already been tonsured. Her beautiful golden hair was cut. She held to the altar, as a ritual sign that she could not be touched. She was in a church sanctuary. She then went to another small community of women on the mountainside outside of Assisi, but they weren't aligned with the friars. And for her, she needed to be in a mutual relationship with Francis and the brothers. They were in this together. And so little by little, the ground was cleared for her to enter into this abandoned small monastery and church of San Damiano, which sat just outside the city of Assisi. And so Claire moves there, and over time, in the beginning, a really small number of women join her. The first is one of her own blood sisters. So imagine the poor Ofreduccio family. About
3 weeks or a month after Claire disappears, young Catherine, later renamed Agnes by St. Francis, goes to join her, joins her in that community up on the mountain. There's no papal protection, and they're literally dragging her physically away when, by some kind of miraculous happening, she becomes so heavy that the uncle can't hold on to her. And he feels that there's some divine judgment, and they drop her to the pavement and they depart. And so now Claire and her sister are the two foundation stones of this new way of living. And over time, other women come to join, not only from Assisi, but interestingly, when she was living in exile in Perugia, some of the women of those families that she got to know and become really good friends with, those women came and joined her. So there was like a network of women who were looking for some different way to enter into giving their lives to a Christian proposal, a way of living the Christian message in connection with their cities. During those early years, probably Francis was able to give her a good bit of advice and guidance, but we don't want to have the idea that he was sitting there dictating and she was just taking notes. No, he was gone a lot of the time, and he had every confidence that she had the level of education from her family, but also what she observed among the Benedictines, to work through a way of living in this little monastery that would be very fruitful and very generative for the community. But at the same time, there was a sort of a surge going on in the church of women looking for alternatives to life in huge monasteries where you needed, frankly, to be sort of wealthy to enter, because you had to bring some kind of an endowment, whether it was land or money, in order for the monastery to take care of you for your lifetime. I am old enough that when I entered our community, we still brought a dowry. It was a laughable small sum that was just sort of a token, but it was a vestige of a time when you came and you knew that the community was going to feed you for at least a whole year, and you weren't earning any income, so you were supposed to bring something with you. But in the Middle Ages, that something was to be a significant financial commitment from your family so that the monastery would have the means to sustain the life of all of the nuns in it. And so Claire, and there were many women looking for a way to live according to the gospel, but without that, first of all, the wealth, and without all the restrictions that were placed upon those enclosed monasteries. The church, however, was nervous. There were like little monasteries and communities popping up in lots of places. Some of them were probably into some weird stuff. Some of them were probably doing wonderful things. But once you get that kind of disorder going, there's always a little bit of an anxiety attack down in Rome. And so the papacy began to say, maybe we better offer a way to these monasteries of being sure that they can be in our good graces. And so a cardinal whose name was Ugolino arrived in central Italy after Claire had been at San Damiano for about 5 or 6 years, and presented her and the sisters with a type of a rule or a constitution that the papacy really felt they should embrace. This had to be a really difficult moment for her, because contained within that were some of the practices of the more monastic communities which they had not begun with at San Damiano. And also the threat that perhaps the friars would no longer be seen as their models and mentors. And so there was a significant back and forth, but Claire did agree to accept many of the provisions and began to make some of the changes that the church officials were asking for
to be in good grace with the church because that was an important value for Frances and Clare. As time went on, that pressure became even more intense, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when I finish the biography. In any event, in the next 10 years or so, Clare is seeing other women join her, but other women are starting to form certain small convents or monasteries in different parts of Italy because the friars are able to encourage women to adopt this way of life, and Clare is able to send sisters to serve as the leaders and as the teachers. And so the sisterhood is growing, and the brotherhood is like off the charts growing. But Frances is also becoming increasingly ill and finding it very difficult to administer the complexities of the order. And so we know that Clare would have been a close observer of the struggles he went through to make sure that the rule that he wrote, that the Vatican was asking for, would be authentic and approved. And also she was closely observing and hearing about the decline in his health. And in fact, just about a year before his death, she was able to physically care for him. He was brought to San Damiano, which probably functioned kind of like a hospice in ancient times before Clare and her sisters moved there. But Clare and her sisters probably operated a kind of hospice there for people who were very ill and people in need of nursing care who had nowhere to turn. One sister said to me once poor Clare in Assisi said, "Margaret, there was no emergency room in Assisi in the 13th century. If you had a medical emergency, you went down to the nuns, either at San Damiano or one of the other monasteries, because the women were trained in the medicinal arts." So Frances was brought to San Damiano, and he stayed there for quite a while, and she was able to physically care for him as he was getting closer and closer to death. And it was there in that time that he wrote the magnificent Canticle of the Sun. And there are some who point out that when he describes the stars, he calls them prezioso clarite e belli, precious, clear, and beautiful. But the word clarite doesn't exist until that time in that poem. And the teacher who pointed that out to my class said, it's his way of saying Clare was a star for him in a very dark time in his life. Frances died in 1226. And Clare, of course, from that point forward, would be faced with enormous challenges. One of them would be a fairly frequent changing of leadership among the friars, so that she was working with different friar leaders, some of whom were walking very closely to the original ideas of Francis, some not so much, but not necessarily in a bad way, just needing to make adjustments as time went on. But she would have been agonizing, I'm sure, sometimes over some of the changes that were being promoted and taking place. Also, during that time, there were additional monasteries now spreading throughout Europe, and one of the most famous was founded by none other than a crown princess of the dynasty in Bohemia, the Premisal dynasty, Saint Agnes of Prague. Agnes had been, I'll just put this in shorthand, okay? The real story is much more complex. She was jilted 3 times in arrangements of royal marriage. You know, she was a crown princess and her marriages were to be arranged, and each time they fell through. And I think Agnes reached a point where she said, basta, enough. And she had come to admire the friars very much, and she determined that she would build a friary and a convent for poor sisters, and sisters went from Assisi into what is now the Czech Republic, and Agnes herself
entered that monastery and became its abbess. And there's a whole drama of Agnes wanting to live the poor life of Clare, this amazingly wealthy, wealthy, wealthy woman, giving up, 1,000 times more than Clare had to give up in order to follow her. And we have Clare's letters to Agnes. Alas, we don't have Agnes's letters to her. So I'm always praying that there's somebody out there who's going to find those letters one of these days, and we'll find out what was it that Agnes had to say. But it's a wonderful companionship of these two women who recognize that they are called to use their public station and their knowledge and their connections to help spread this new way of living the gospel. Clare, however, recognizes as she's getting closer to death that when she dies, and I have a feeling that the sisters were lobbying hard, that she had not left a written rule that the sisters would be able to follow after her death. And these ongoing pressures from Rome's officials to change, to get property, to have an income, were going to be a constant problem for her. And so she began with the sisters, because she did everything in consultation with them, to develop a rule, which she did. When she was finished with that document, she had it approved by the Cardinal Protector. It's a new Cardinal Protector by this time. And that was sufficient. I mean, that was very, very high authorization. But as she lay dying, Pope Innocent IV came to visit her on her deathbed. Now, this gives us an idea of her stature. The Pope, it is true, was in Perugia. He wasn't coming all the way from Rome. But he heard Clare was dying. Now, Clare had already said to him she didn't want any of the new regulations he favored. With all due respect, Your Holiness, we can't do that. And he came to see her out of respect. And so he came to visit her on her deathbed. And I imagine it goes this way. He brings her the Eucharist. Here's her confession. She is overwhelmed, overjoyed. And then he says, "Is there anything else I can do?" And she said, "I was hoping you would ask." "Would you put your signature on my rule?" So they took the very parchment that she had with him back to Perugia that day. And in 24 hours, because this was not the normal way to do it, usually it would be a whole new, beautiful parchment. He wrote his name and said, "We're doing it this way because I agree with the one making the petition." And he put his seal, sent it back to her, and she got it within 24 hours of her death. Now, it was buried with her. 10 years later, a new pope puts in a new rule that a huge percentage of Poor Clare monasteries felt obliged to follow. So you could say, what's the use? The use is they found that original rule. And now, 800 years later, monasteries all over the world can go back to that rule and ask to have all of their constitutions and their profession of their vows according to the original intention of Clare. There had always been a few monasteries that held on to that, but they were few and far between. And so I say, it was Pope John, good Pope John the 23rd, who said, we have to have the courage to work at things that will go well beyond our lifetime. And Clare did that. She couldn't be sure beyond her lifetime what would happen. But she created something that could be a touchstone for future generations. One of the reasons she's such a heroine to me. So I just want to bring forward now 4 acts of courage that I think make Clare a standout in terms of a model, not only for women, but for men as well. But let's say, given the secondary position of women in the medieval culture, and especially in a Roman medieval culture where the patriarch of the family had total control of the family, her courage is all the more remarkable. The first is her rejection of the class level of her family and all the obligations that would have been put on her, but also the life of ease and privilege she would have had. To be willing to walk away from that in a time when that level of nobility was sort of fighting to hold on to its prerogatives and counting on every man and woman in the family to stand on the barricades with them, had to take enormous courage. And we know that on the masculine side there was outrage, but we also know that over the years, the women of her family all ended up joining her at San Damiano, her mother and both of her sisters. So she was creating an island for women to be co-responsible to create a way of life according to the gospel. It was new and exciting and energizing. Second, fidelity to her friendship with Francis. You know, we would all think, wouldn't it have been great to have been a friend of Francis? Well, if you've read his life very carefully, not so much on some days. You know, he could get very extreme in his views, in his denunciations of friars who did the wrong thing. He was not an easy, even-tempered kind of person. We had a faculty member at St. Bonaventure in the School of Franciscan Studies who taught the life of Francis in the summer. And at the end of the first week, she would say to the students, most of whom were newly invested novices, now I know you've just entered the order and you're dying to be like Francis, but now that you really know a little bit about him, do you want him for a roommate? I always thought, good to do a little reality check. So Frances, she was the one who was the more even-tempered, I think, and able to see a bigger picture at times. But she maintains that commitment to the teaching of Francis, even when she knows he's being assaulted by disagreement, whether it's from the church or his own brothers or the people at large. And she never wavers in that. And she constantly refers back to it as a touchstone. And even though in the later years of his life, he gave less and less time and presence to her and the sisters. First of all, he was not well. Second, he was out, traveling to different countries. But third, there were times when he was afraid if he was going too often to see the sisters, it would give a bad example. People would imply the wrong motives. And so he decided he needed to be a good example and not be spending too much time with her and the other women. And I would imagine Clara saying, oh, really? Thanks a lot. And in fact, it was his friend and hers, Brother Elias, who convinced Francis, come on, Francis, they deserve and need a word of encouragement for you. Look what they've gone through, in joining us. And so I think holding fast to that friendship was, it's not a Hollywood script, let's just say. The fourth thing is that she had physical courage. One of the great stories about her is the story that in 1240 or 1241, there is an attack on Assisi by an army called Saracens. What that meant is these were mercenaries, could have been from North Africa, but mercenary soldiers hired in a war by the Emperor Frederick against the papacy. They're advancing on Assisi, and you come to San Damiano before you get to Assisi, and because San Damiano is outside the walls, there's no real protection. And those soldiers breach the walls. They are ready to crash in to the monastery, even though it's now more cloistered than it was in the beginning. The nuns are, of course, totally terrified. And they come to Claire, and Claire says, "Bring me the Pics of the Eucharist." And while she's often pictured holding a monstrance, what she was holding was really a beautiful ivory box that the Eucharist would be reserved in. And they took her to a window overlooking the courtyard, and she held it up, and these soldiers became terrified and withdrew. And we don't know what they thought they were seeing, but at the end of the day, that ended that attack. And a year later, when they were threatening to come back and lay siege to the city, she and the sisters entered into a period of fasting and prayer, and again, the siege was called off. So there is a connection to her people that means you have to be willing to face the dangers that your people face. And you have to be willing to know what's going on in the world that your people are living in, and not be so shut off that you don't get the political and the military and the economic sufferings that are going on around you. And the last profile in courage will be precisely what I spoke to, which is her I'll call it her battle, maybe not the best language, for preserving her way of life that she shared with Francis. She wouldn't see it as her way, it was our way, the way shared with Francis. The fact of the matter is, even though she and Francis were in complete agreement, they were in complete agreement on two really important things. One, that the friars would always be caring for the sisters. What did that mean? Sacramentally, spiritually. Being there, the friars who would offer the liturgy for them, bring the Eucharist, hear confessions, come with a word of a sermon of encouragement. But also, in hard times, the friars would help out by helping them with procuring food or other necessities. Mainly, the way the sisters survived was they worked to survive. What Claire and the sisters did was create a kind of cottage industry, probably of needlework, of spinning silk and making fine linens and silken coverings to be used in churches for the Eucharist. This was a period in which the church was reforming the rules for how the Eucharist was reserved. And before this, there was not a lot of care or attention to a beautiful tabernacle or clean linens and corporals and things like that. And so Claire and the sisters would make these linens and then have them sent out to the various churches around Assisi. Well, then, what would the churches do? What do you need? Bread? You need some firewood, you need some oil, you need some lamb. It was a barter system that allowed the sisters to maintain themselves. What Rome wanted was the sisters to get a lot of property, rent it out, receive the rent, and in that way be secure. And Claire was determined not to fall into that older model, which meant if you have property, you have to defend it. If you have property, you're always going to be worried about its maintenance and its care. I used to say about our mother house when I was the mother general, we don't own the mother house owns us. We never catch up with the roof or the heating system or whatever it is. So she and Francis understood that they would work to secure their needs. They weren't wanting to be poor so that they'd be starving. They wanted not to be encumbered, so they were free to move to where they saw the need to share a gospel way of living or solving problems. And so she could not convince church officials that this was possible for women, because until that point, the church and society, frankly, I'm not blaming these church officials, had always believed the only way for women to be secure is your father, your husband, your brother. And if you don't have that male protection, this is Rome, patriarchal, then you better have one heck of an endowment or an inheritance to live off of. And the breakthrough that is happening is no, we might be able to live by our labor. And by the reciprocity that our brothers, the friars, won't let us starve if we hit a really bad time, because they'll have more ability to take care of those problems. So I want to simply say that she held out for those ideals right up to the day of her death by seeking that papal signature. You know, like nobody could contravene that she had gone the full distance on that. And I also think that what she leaves us is a legacy about how do we live in communion with the church, even when we're not always in agreement with how things are going in the church. So I just offer these 4 ideas. First of all, everything she does is motivated by faithfulness to the gospel. This isn't a woman's ideology or, we're freeing our generation. This is, we believe this is what the gospel is asking us to do. And we are following the way Jesus would have us live. And so that was the solid foundation for her actions. Secondly, she respected the offices of these church officials. Even when she was saying, please don't ask me to accept that, it was done with a graciousness and a real sincerity that left their relationship very much intact. We know, for example, Cardinal Ugolino wrote her a beautiful letter about how much he missed having conversations with her. This is even when they were disagreeing. So we know that they respected her and they were somewhat in awe of her, not somewhat, really in awe. Finally, her behavior is disciplined by the example of Jesus. That she's going to behave in the presence of a difficulty or authority or contradiction as Jesus would. Jesus, who was meek and humble of heart. And finally, she had a sense of spiritual solidarity with others in the church, whether it was her friend Agnes in Prague or brother Elias of Cortona, who later fell on hard times with the friars and with the papacy, or the various popes with whom she worked. She managed to maintain a spiritual solidarity and friendship no matter how difficult things got. I think those are really good lessons to take away, because it says that there is this side of heaven. We don't have heaven. And so as we live in human communities and human institutions, there will always be those kind of sandpaper times when things are very difficult to work out. But to be guided by Jesus and to see Jesus in the other becomes the litmus test for how we move forward in an evangelical way. So we will celebrate the Feast of St. Clare on August 11th, and I hope that this has been helpful to you, who've been served all these years by Franciscan friars, to deepen an appreciation of what I like to call the first Franciscan woman. I have a former student who says she wasn't Sister Margaret. I think there were others who were there before her. I said, okay, but you've got to prove it first. Then we'll take away that title. So this was the first Franciscan woman, but she certainly isn't the last to be a wonderful role model and example for all of us. So I hope that you will join with the friars in celebrating St. Clare along with St. Francis, August 11th and October 4th. God bless you, and thanks very much.
I'm sure that Margaret would be open to any questions that you have. No questions. That's fine too.
The hour is late,
Yes.
but there's someone. No. Other friars were.
Margaret, excuse me. You have to repeat it so that,
Oh, I'm sorry. The question is, Francis was not ordained a priest, so how is it that the friars become chaplains who say Mass and so on? From an early period, I think the first priest to enter the order was Sylvester, who was already ordained in Assisi. So early in the formation of the brotherhood, men who were either already ordained or who wished to be ordained could become part of the fraternity. And they were probably at the very beginning ordained in the diocese where they were. Only later did the order form its own, we'll say, seminaries, where they would have been ordained possibly by their own provincials who had a status equivalent to that of a bishop. So there were priests functioning from a very early stage. But Francis was not a priest, and Brother Elias was not a priest. But soon after, it became the rule that only a priest could be the head of the order. Now, Pope Francis has just punched a big hole in that, which is good, because for about 40 years, the friars have been asking to change that restriction, that because a man is not ordained a priest, he cannot be made the head of the congregation or of a fraternity. So it's been a long-standing rule. Any other questions? What would a normal day for Claire be like? First of all, the sisters would say, and this would be, she did adopt and exercise things that would be like a Benedictine practice. So the office of the hours, the divine office. So they would have begun in the morning with the office, and if you do the entire office according to a monastic schedule, you're in the chapel multiple times during the day. In the middle of the day, in the evening, late at night, and then in the middle of the night again. So they were following that schedule. I mean, if you read Thomas Merton's books, talks about getting up in the middle of the night. That's what they were doing. And then in between, they had all the tasks that any community would have. Who's cooking? Who's cleaning up? Who's taking care of the garden? Who's managing? There were always sisters who were sick. And I think they lived in very close quarters, so it's probably true. I mean, they would have been a COVID hotbed more than once. And we laugh, but Francis actually wrote a message to the sisters saying, all of you who are fatigued by the care of the sick, bear it with patience. So there must have been a lot of experience of nursing their own, plus people who came to them for help. And then whatever teaching, like there were young girls who would be brought to the monastery and sort of fostered there. That was a common practice in the Middle Ages. They didn't have to stay and become nuns, but there would be teaching done for them. She did teaching for her own women who came. Probably a good bit of time conferring with leaders of the friars from time to time. And then the actual handwork. And there is at least one example in Assisi where we can't say for sure she did this, but it's an alb, huge, long white alb, priestly vestment, that was done in the style of the time, and so it was believed to be hers. But what we read is, even when she was sick, she would have herself propped up, and she would continue to work at her needlework. And at first, years ago, reading that, I just thought, well, isn't that nice? She did embroidery. And only later did I come to realize this wasn't like a pastime. This was work. And I'm trying to learn a little bit more about the fact that they had silk. And I want to know, did they have their own silkworms? Because that was a woman's industry in the Middle Ages. Some women became really wealthy and powerful by controlling the silk market in certain regions. So there was plenty to do just to, maintain themselves physically, and then the spiritual teachings that she did. You're welcome. Oh, I'm sorry. Abraham wants to not lose these questions.
Earlier on, you said that she wanted to evangelize, and so she didn't want to live the monastic life. But what you're describing, she really didn't get out to do that?
Okay, what I did not make real clear is that probably in the first 5 to 7 years after she settled in San Damiano, there was not a strict separation of the sisters from ordinary tasks. And it's very likely that she and the women would have gone into the city. They could have been nursing, they could have been midwives. There were women who were widows. They could have gone down into the valley where the hospice for lepers was, where Francis and the friars had worked. And so there was a real exchange of them being out and among the people, but they would always come back at night. And we have a letter from a man who eventually became a very well-known bishop saying, the church is a mess. He's saying the church is a mess everywhere, but I have found a big consolation in central Italy, and it's this group called the Lesser Brothers and the Lesser Sisters. And he talks about the women and how the people admire them. What happened is, after Cardinal Ugolino began the campaign to get the sisters to be more regularized, Clare accepted more restrictions. But they were very, very strict according to the Ugolino rule. She didn't observe them with the same strictness. So, for example, where the rule said, once she enters, the nun will never leave again, she would say, you can leave if it's obvious or necessary or just or whatever. So she would go, perhaps to help set up a new monastery. She might send a sister somewhere to procure something that they needed. But it wasn't an easy, just out and about kind of existence. They had to be somewhat cautious about that. So yes, after 1217 and going further, there was more and more restriction. And then over time, you have branches of Poor Clares today that are very different. Some with very strict rules of cloister and separation, and others that are much more open to being engaged with people and with allowing people to come and visit or make a retreat or participate in the Mass with them. So there's a bit of a division of what is the authentic way. And she lived both. You know, she lived a more open to the world, and she lived one where there was more caution. Oops, and then Abraham, there's going to be one way back there.
So it sounds like she was a bit of a rebellion. It was a rebellion situation. She was kind of rebelling against the norm of what a cloistered life would be.
I don't think she was rebelling because she wasn't. Let me say this. It wasn't as if she had chosen to enter into a monastic setting and then rebelled against what she found. She had never intended that. She wanted to set up a stable foundation for women who would partner with the friars in this work of witnessing to the gospel. When there were more and more demands on her to change the way she wanted to do it, you could say rebel, but the point is, I would say more, she was negotiating all the time. It wasn't like she was off in Assisi saying, hell no, I'm not going to do that. She was engaged in conversation, saying, I can't do it for these reasons. And I think that's a different kind of relationship of trying to help the church authority see that there's a reason why I'm trying to do it this way. So, and I do think it's easy to picture her as a kind of rebel. For example, at one point, the Pope had given a directive that the friars were no longer to be obliged to go to the monasteries to give chaplaincy service. And she declared, if they're not going to bring us the bread of the Word of God, then we won't let them bring us the bread of our tables. And she went on a hunger strike. Well, that's pretty rebellious. And I have a feeling that when the word got to Rome, it was like, oh, God, I don't need this. Okay, let's come up with a solution. You know, the poor Pope is like, what is she going to do to me next? So I think popes had many a sleepless night because of her.
Sister, how old was she when she died, and what did she die of?
She was in her early 60s, and first of all, she fasted to excess when she was a young woman, shortly after she entered into San Damiano. In fact, Francis and the bishop had to come and command her to start taking more physical nourishment. So at that point, she probably had already done violence to her body, and then simply because they never ate plentiful food, over time, those weaknesses would have overcome her. But I don't think we have a medical term or diagnosis for her final condition at this point, not that I'm aware of.
Hey, again, thank you so much, Margaret. Appreciate it. Thank you all very much for coming. And as Sister Margaret mentioned, August 11th is the Feast of Clare. We will certainly be celebrating that here. And again, you can find her writings online at franciscantradition.org. So feel free to access that. And all those letters that she wrote to Agnes are available online. You can also get them at the library and Amazon and other places as well. But thank you very much for attending. We appreciate it. Again, thank you.